You can even go beyond failure and do a 10 plus RPE when you are doing special types of training that we're going to get to later. But first, let's talk about what failure is. Failure is an interesting concept when it comes to weightlifting. Most people who are not weightlifters think of failure as a bad thing. There's either success or failure, right? But in resistance training, it's actually a good thing to train to failure, and it's something that actually coincides with success of progressive overload. Failure is when you have worked until you cannot anymore and you start to fail at the movement pattern that you are supposed to be doing. So when you have trained to failure, that would mean training to 10 RPE or 0 RIR, and it is a great thing to do sometimes, at the end of a block of progressive overload, and you're trying to push your body as hard and as far as you possibly can, training as hardcore and intensely as possible by exerting, the maximum level of relative effort. However, it's not something that you should be doing often, all right? At least not to absolute failure, okay? Because there's actually two different types of failure that you need to know about, all right? There is technical failure, and this is the point at which your technique begins to break down, all right? So this usually begins to happen at around 2 RIR. You will find that you are no longer executing the movement perfectly, perhaps even 3 RIR. So for instance, if you're doing pull downs, and most of the set is with perfect form, full range of motion, right? Not a lot of body language, but the more you go on, the more it turns into body language, right? And you're leaning into it and then thrusting, heaving and hoeing with that full body movement. That is when you have crossed the line into technical failure. You are no longer using perfect technique, and you should be failing soon after that, all right? Failure usually comes a few reps or so after that, and absolute failure is when you can't even move the weight anymore. Sometimes hold on to it. But now if you're doing an exercise where you were locked in, like if you were doing those pull downs with wrist straps so that the bar couldn't drop from your hands, and you hit technical failure, right? There should be a certain point in which you would just stop the exercise rather than continuing to just heave and hoe it just to try to get it like halfway down. After technical failure, your form is going to be worse and worse with every rep. So if the weight doesn't drop out of your hands before it has turned into 50% range of motion and no longer your target muscles doing a lot of the work, right? And it's being more done by the rest of your body, at that point, you should just consider that you have reached absolute failure, even though you're still holding on to the weight, because you're no longer even following the movement pattern that you are supposed to, okay? So absolute failure happens when you can no longer do the movement pattern that you're supposed to. So there's a sort of thin, blurry line between those two. But basically, knowing where failure is helps us to know how hard we are training and if we are training hard enough. But now what is interesting about failure is that it is really difficult to know where it is until you're actually starting to reach it. And what you'll find is that until you have actually practiced reaching absolute failure, if you're trying to gauge your failure before knowing where absolute failure actually is, you're generally going to be off. What often happens with trainers and clients who test this is that when the trainer tells the client, go till 2 RIR, and they do, and then they say, okay, now go to failure, the client will often go much further than 2 more reps. All right, a lot of them will get 4 or 6, or sometimes even as many as 10. And this even happened to me recently, where I was working with a trainer who had me do an exercise, and he said, do it until like 2 or 3 RIR. So I did 16 reps, and I was already using the full rack for just one leg. This is an exercise I've been doing since like 4 or 5 years ago. So I did all the progressive overload with weight that I could on the machine. I mastered the exercise, and now I'm doing, the full rack with just one leg. So I do 16 reps, thinking, oh, this is like a lot of reps, right? And this feels like it's, 2 or 3 RIR. But then he has me do another set. He says, again, 2 to 3 RIR. I thought to myself about how I knew that people will oftentimes misgauge their RIR when they haven't gone to failure yet. So I said to myself, it didn't even feel like I was hitting technical failure last time. So this time, let's go until we start to feel that technical failure setting in. So I pushed myself, and I got 24 reps, and that was with like a 3-ish RIR. I was just starting to get to technical failure, and I was like, wow, I had totally misjudged my RIR before. So this is just another reason why, with exercises that are important for you to be doing progressive overload of, that you be able to judge the intensity and relative effort you are using accurately. And so in order to do that, you have to push yourself to failure sometimes, just to see how many reps you can actually get, because until you've done that, you really don't know, all right? You don't know how hard you're training until you push yourself to failure and know where failure is, and then how to gauge the RPE based upon that. So kind of like testing your 1RM for strength training, for hypertrophy training, you need to test your RPE and RIR sometimes by going to failure. Now, because technical failure usually starts at about 2 RIR, maybe 3 sometimes, that's why those are the ideal numbers to stop at for most of your training. So it is okay for you to train to technical failure on most or about all of your sets except for on your deload and reload weeks. You can rep out until the form starts to break down, and that is a great way to train. Absolute failure, of course, occurs at 0 IR. That's why it's called that, because at that point you don't have any more energy to do any more reps, at least not without assistance or dropping the weight. Okay, now it is okay to go past technical failure late in your cycle, and then to even go past absolute failure at the very end. And pushing yourself that hard is a great way to generate the most hypertrophic stimulus possible. And it can help you to break through plateaus and just really condition you to have a greater work capacity as well. However, training to and past failure has a serious downside in that stimulus comes at great cost. All right, it has a very bad SFR, as I said, causes much more fatigue than stimulus. So that's why you need to only be doing this stuff at the very end of your cycle when you have a deload week afterwards to recover and recuperate your energies. So most of the time you should be training to about 2 RIR or technical failure, at least for intermediates. For beginners, you would want to be training generally to 3 RIR, and for advanced people, you'd want to be generally training more to 1 RIR. But now you're probably wondering about training past failure. One way of doing this is by using wrist straps for any pulling motions to ensure that the weight does not fall out of your hands when you are losing your grip strength, all right? So that really helps you to push the line of absolute failure much further. But you can also train past failure by having a spotter help you to do a few more assisted repetitions, removing just a little bit of the load, and even helping you to do some force negatives when you can't lift the weight very well, but you can still perform eccentrics. But if you do not have a spotter, the best and safest way for you to perform past failure would be by doing drop sets, especially on machines where it is perfectly safe and ergonomical. All right, and then you basically will just train to failure and then drop the weight down and keep going, as you have seen me do in part 3 in the leg training video, where in spite of my inability to perform very heavy barbell squats when using the safe ergonomical hack squat machine, I was able to do progressive overload much further beyond that and go and do 630 pounds or something like that. And then after doing 5 reps of that, I pushed myself past failure by dropping the weight down and continuing to do 5 more, and then dropping it down and continuing to do 5 more. And then I did the same thing on leg press, starting with 730 pounds, okay? So machines are ideal for training past failure because of how ergonomical and safe they make it. Okay, so that's the best thing you could do if you do not have a spotter, which you really do need to perform past failure with a barbell. So training with a high RPE of up to 10 plus is a really great thing to do in a periodized fashion at the end of a cycle. You should never do it early on in a cycle. And if you notice yourself starting to hit failure on exercises early on in your cycle, then you need to adjust the weight, okay? Because that should not be happening, all right? And you do not want to be training close to or at failure for too long, all right? And be trying to continue to do that for the rest of your planned cycle. If it's more than a couple of weeks, that is overtraining and is causing too much fatigue and too much wear and tear on your body. It is just too taxing and exhausting and will lead to injury, okay? Because that is overtraining. With training to failure, less is more, okay? Doing it a little bit will produce more gains, but doing it more will kill them. So in a properly periodized program of progressive overload, you want to start your mesocycle with a microcycle of low RPE, like 5 on a deload week, then 6 on a reload week, and then you go up to 7 for about, 2 or 3 weeks, a couple few weeks. And then, you bridge the gap, go into 8, have a week where you're doing 7 to 8, then have it be 8 for another couple few weeks, then do 1 week at 9 RPE, and finally a week of 10 RPE. And if you still think that you have the energy for it and that you are hardcore enough, you can even do another week after that of 10 plus RPE, training past failure. But in many cases, you're not going to have the energy. You want to conserve your energy, and on your last week of 10 RPE, just do some sets that are 10 plus RPE. And then immediately after that, you're going to do a deload week at about 5 RPE again. Okay, so that is how you periodize progressive overload of RPE. This will give you the maximum hypertrophy stimulus and adaptations without overtraining and hurting yourself.